Okay, welcome everybody. This is our second event on the midterms, sponsored by Conversations in the Social Sciences and the IPK. We had an event 2 weeks ago where we were talking about voter turnout, and we heard a lot of stories about how people don't turn out in midterms, and especially young people do not turn out in midterms. Things have gotten a little bit more interesting since then. We have 4 guests speaking tonight. I'm going to present them in the order in which they'll be speaking. First, we'll hear from Ashley Koning, who is the director of the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling at RUTGERS. Then we'll hear from Pat Egan, who is a professor in the politics department here. Then we'll hear from Christina Greer, who is a professor of political science at Fordham. And then we'll hear from Jeff Manza, who is a professor of sociology here at NYU. I've asked each of them to be as brief, not as brief as possible, but brief in their remarks so that we can have ample time for discussion, because I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. Thank you. Thanks, Ashley.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for letting me be your token Jersey girl tonight. I appreciate it. I am from the Bridge and Tunnel crowd from Rutgers, right in New Brunswick. And specifically, Rutgers University has the Eagleton Institute of Politics. We've been around since 1956, and the Institute has multiple different centers. Our rock star center of the midterms has certainly by far and away been the Center for American Women in Politics. Any stat that you've heard come out about women in politics and women running this past election cycle has most likely come from them. We are also, they are one of the oldest along with us. I'm from the Eagleton Center for Public Interest Polling. We've been around since 1971. I have not. But the center has been around since 1971, and we're actually the oldest polling center based on an academic institution in the country. And so, of course, midterms and any election cycle, they're very important times for us. Surprisingly so, in New Jersey, or as we like to say a lot of the times, Blue Jersey, we had a surprisingly close race for our Senate election with Bob Menendez versus Bob Hugin, or as I like to say, the race of the Bobs, or the battle of the Bobs. But so New Jersey was even exciting territory in a midterm election that I think had some exciting things and some very different storylines all around, and that's why I kind of like to start out the night by saying this was a choose-your-own-adventure piece. If you remember those books where you got to turn to a certain page. So I feel like for partisans, it was a choose-your-own-adventure night, and it continues to be so, a week or so after we had the midterm elections. So we have 2 different stories going on here with the House and the Senate, and I want to walk us through a little bit of the results of the night of the midterms, as well as the exit poll results. I was fortunate enough, I actually was on the ground with the national exit polling firm on that Tuesday night to kind of get a bird's eye view and an insider's look of what was going on with the races as they were being called. So to actually see how the numbers were working in the heat of the moment was just kind of a fascinating and exhilarating experience that hopefully I can touch a little bit upon as we talk about what kind of happened that night and in the days to come. So we know that, of course, the House went blue, and we have this whole debate about what does this mean, knowing that the Senate did go red, the House up 39 seats for Democrats, the Senate up 2 seats for Republicans. So how do we classify this, or how do we classify what happened on that night, and what can the data tell us, specifically the national exit polls, what can the data from those exit polls tell us about where we are in 2018, and maybe even where we're going in 2020, and what all of this means for polling. So I think one of the biggest struggles that the media and political scientists are having, and journalists and all of the above, is what do we call what happened on the night of the midterms? There was a characterization of this being a big wave leading up to election night. And so when we saw that maybe this wave wasn't as great as our expectations thought it would be, that wave narrative kind of started wavering back and forth a little bit. And so some people are saying, was this a wave? Was this a splash? Was this a trickle? What did this mean for the Democrats? So let's take a little bit of a look at what exactly happened that night. The average competitive House race that night was actually in 2016 +8 for Trump, meaning that in the average competitive House race, these districts were 8 points more likely to usually have gone for Trump in 2016, and Democrats needed 23 of those seats to take back the House, and as we saw, they are at this point at 39. So, you know, the downside was these were Republican-leaning districts on average, but the upside was that the GOP certainly had more seats that they had to defend, being that they started out with 240 seats in the House. The Senate proves to be a little bit harder, and that's why we're seeing this disparity of the House and Senate diverging in the midterms. The average Senate race, instead of being just 8 points, it was double this in 2016. Trump usually won these competitive Senate races by 16 points. So this was a harder climb for Democrats to get. And it should be known that Democrats had more seats simply to defend in the Senate. They had more seats that were up. 26 out of the 35 seats up for re-election or up for election in the Senate were from Democrats. So you have two very different settings of what's happening in the House and the Senate, and why this adds complexity to just calling this a straight wave or a straight red wall, perhaps. And there were talk of did the red wall hit? So the trickle or the red wall argument goes as this. There were some disappointing losses at the beginning of the night. They came earlier from East Coast states that closed earlier in the night, were called earlier in the night, obviously. And this started to set this narrative where we typically think that the opposition party will be gaining seats in the midterms. And when we saw that not happening on election night, that narrative of the wave started going away with journalists and with those who were following the midterms. And a big part of this was we had a lot of emotional ties to races that garnered national attention, whether it was with Beto or Stacey Abrams or Gillum or the Kentucky Six. We saw that there was a lot of emotion and rhetoric and drive around these races on all of the major news networks, that they would be barometers for the country. The interesting thing about this, while we saw that the Florida governor's race was very, very close and actually forecast for Gillum ahead of election night, we see that actually if we look at the numbers of the average compared to the final results for the other three candidates with these nationalized stories, they were all leaning Republican anyway, but the emotional attachment with these candidates, and when they've either suffered losses or losses now going into recounts, that kind of put a chink in the armor of this wave storyline. But I think we have to also kind of look overall about what happened on the midterms, and not only on election night, but what continues to happen as Democrats pick up seats. Democrats are now, if we talk about a House popular vote, they're +7, and this backs that blue wave argument. So even though, again, we have seen a divergence between the House and Senate for the first time in a while, this is actually the largest gain in a generation for House seats for the Democrats. And this is the first time that the House and Senate have actually swung away from each other in 1996. And what can't be emphasized enough is this is really considered a wave, given especially how difficult the electoral map is since being drawn under the Republican Party for Democrats to even win. So there's a lot of back and forth about what do we consider this election. Again, choose your own story, pick the page that you like the best, but a lot of evidence on both sides here, and especially for that blue wave argument given the following circumstances. And in fact, Democrats won 69% of all Senate races, so even with everything against the Democratic Party in the Senate, we see that they won a solid majority of those seats that they were up for. So let's kind of shift away from what actually happened on the map on election night and in the days to come and go a little bit into the national exit polls and some of the demographic divides. I think it's no surprise to anyone that there was, of course, a gender gap, but more than ever, this gender gap was absolutely historic for the midterms. Women went for the Democratic candidate over the Republican by 19 points. The Democratic gender gap on the Democratic candidate was 12 points. The Republican gender gap was -11. And this can be attributed to three main prongs that are under the hood of the gender gap: marriage, men, and motherhood. So among married women, they actually went +10 for Democrats, a notoriously difficult group for Democrats to obtain. And while Democrats have always gotten a majority of unmarried women, and they did so by a 2-to-1 margin this time around, they definitely made gains among married women for the first time in a while. Men were actually moving more towards the left as well, so we would actually have seen a wider gender gap if men voted as they usually have, but men moved to the left as well in the midterms. And then finally, with motherhood or parental status, we see that actually mothers were 21 points more likely to go for the Democratic candidate, and they made up actually 16% of the electorate. So gender played a huge factor, but as we all know, a lot of things coalesce with gender and interact with gender, that we see differences by things like race and ethnicity. So always a prominent factor in the gender gap by breaking it down. We've seen in past elections that white women have really, in the past, leaned towards the Republican candidate, or they've been sort of these swing voters, white women in particular. So in 2016, they went for Trump by 9 points, and this in 2018 now, they were tied 49% to 49% between the Democratic and the Republican candidates. We see that even though when we break this down by race, that gender gap, even as small as it may be, still persists in every racial or ethnic category, with women more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate than men. And women college graduates, again, we see that confluence of education, race, and gender, and education being such a prominent factor in 2016, women college graduates strongly went for Democratic candidates by 20 points. But again, partisanship kind of trumps everything, right? So we talk about the gender gap, but also looking at it by partisanship, we see that the Democrats gained with independents, but of course they didn't gain with Republicans. Democratic women and men voted for the Democratic candidate, Republican women and men voted for the Republican candidate. Independents, again, always in the middle somewhat and more split and more torn, though leaning towards the Democratic candidate, especially independent women. The big divide here, kind of the sexy word of 2016, was education, right? And talking about educated versus non-educated. Well, this time it's suburbia. So suburban areas were those that delivered to Democrats this time around. So we're still talking about education in 2018, but it's really this suburban rural divide that played a huge role in the midterms this time around. So Democrats picked up leaning Republican seats that were not in rural areas. So whether they were partially suburban, had suburban characteristics. 538 did a wonderful dissection with city maps in terms of classifying different areas. Democrats actually did very well in these areas, and on top of picking up a lot of suburbs, they kept and maintained their urban areas as well. And they also grabbed a number of Romney-Trump suburban districts. So districts that voted for Romney and then also voted for Trump, these districts were leaning towards Democrats or picked up by Democrats in 2018. The thing is here, though, why there's such a divide between suburban and rural areas, no gains were made by Democrats in rural areas at all. So they made no net gains in those areas that we can consider rural. So not only are we seeing these dividing lines emerge since 2016 by education, but now suburban versus rural has become a really heated demographic that we see divisions emerging on as well. Of course, we saw familiar racial divisions in the exit polling. About a quarter of Hispanics cast a ballot in a midterm election for the first time this year, and they made up actually a very large percentage of voters in several of the competitive races, including in Florida, and of course went majority Democrat in these competitive races as well. So white voters were more likely to go Republican by 10 points. Black, Latino, Asian, and multiracial voters all went for Democratic candidates. And of course, there was a large influence of whether or not people thought that whites or minorities had the racial advantage. So those who were more likely to vote for Republican candidates were more likely to say that minorities had an advantage, whereas those who were voting for Democratic candidates were more likely to say that whites had an advantage in society today. Another thing that emerged in the 2018 midterms is a divide by age, and we really haven't seen a division by age when it comes to electoral cycles in at least 2 decades. This kind of just emerged in 2018, where we saw that those who are under 50, about 6 in 10 of them voted for the Democratic candidate. So pretty solidly blue up until 49. And then, of course, education is still a major factor. We saw this diverge for the first time in 2016, especially among white voters without a college education. So education still continues to become a major factor in not only vote choice, but also increasingly in partisan identification. 76% of national exit polls agree that the country is growing more divided. 16% said that this was the first time they ever voted in a midterm election. And among those who it was their first time voting in a midterm, they chose Democrats over Republicans by 26 points. And voter turnout was unprecedented this time around, usually in midterms averaging around 40%, now at 49%, with most of the states experiencing larger than normal turnout, especially in states like Georgia, which actually hit 55%. In my own profession, it's getting increasingly harder to do polling for election cycles. And we can touch upon this a little bit later, but there are a whole host of factors that have been making it increasingly difficult to actually poll the results for an election day. We saw a lot of this kind of discussion around 2016. Some of it has reared its head in 2018, although there had been a lot of polling, especially on contested races. But we can talk a little bit later about things like declining response rates, the difficulty and the ambiguity of determining likely voters, how these results get interpreted in the news, the quantity or the lack of statewide polling that we've seen, and how that affects how precise we are come election day, and how we need to kind of learn to embrace uncertainty more when it comes to the polls in order to know that these facts and figures are simply kind of snapshots in time and not necessarily the be-all, end-all that will determine election day definitively. So that was a little taste of the national exit polls. Hopefully that set the scene well for you guys. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. As David said, I'm Pat Egan. I teach here in politics at NYU. I also have a courtesy appointment with the Wagner School. Oh, right, exact. Sorry. With the Wagner School of Public Service. And my specialty is American public opinion, political behavior, and political attitudes in the U.S. public. I also had the privilege of being kind of on the ground on election night. I was an elections analyst at NBC News up at Rockefeller Center. And so was writing up some of these exit poll results as they came in. Ashley gave us a really nice overview of a lot of the themes that we saw play out in the 2018 midterm election, and I'm going to drill down into one of them that Ashley talked a little bit about, which is essentially a growing divide along the lines of education among non-Hispanic white Americans. And this is a picture that is really probably, I think, the most important and striking development in American politics that we've seen over the last few elections. What you see here is data from the American National Election Studies, which is a survey that is funded by your tax dollars and is actually an amazing public resource for Americans. It's publicly available data that goes back to 1948 that assesses how Americans vote and why they vote. What you see here is data going back to 1980, in which the American electorate is split down by whether people are non-Hispanic white or voters of color, and then whether they have a college degree or do not. And what I want to point your attention to are two really important trends here. The first is that among voters of color, what used to be a divide between college and non-college voters has really shrunk over the last few years, to the point where in the 2016 election, there really was not even a statistical difference between voters of color with a college education and those without a college education. Very, very solid support for the Democratic presidential candidate with only about 1 in 5 of voters of color supporting Donald Trump in 2016. And as you look back in time, that used to not be the case. There used to be a much bigger gap between voters of color with a college education who tended to support Republicans at slightly higher rates than voters of color without a college education. What is the case among white voters is just the opposite, and that's what I really want to focus on tonight, which is that from 1980 onward, and really it's also true if you go further back, the preferences among non-Hispanic white voters, whether or not they had a college education, pretty much paralleled one another over time. And that you can see if you look at those two green lines at the top of the graph going back to 1980. They pretty much follow one another more or less through the 2008 election. And thereafter, in 2012 and particularly in 2016, you see a growing gap between white voters without a college education who are moving sharply toward the Republican Party and white voters with a college education who start to move toward the Democrats. And that was particularly pronounced in 2016. So this has both important implications for the electoral fortunes of the two parties and that are sort of obvious, and I'll talk about them in a sec. And they also have really important implications for the coalitions of the two parties and therefore the kinds of policies that the two parties are likely to pursue when they're in office. And that's what I'm going to talk about at the end of my little brief speech here. So one question, of course, that arises by looking at this data from presidential elections is, were we going to see the same thing happening in the midterms here in 2018? And that is entirely the case. I'm not a Mac person. How do I advance in this slide? What do I push? Down arrow, thank you. Okay. I'm a PC guy. Okay, so this is data from the national exit polls that Ashley was showing us. She showed us data from 2018. Here is data going back all the way to 1990, and it's the same, the electorate's sliced in the same way, which is the green lines are non-Hispanic whites divided by college educated and non-college educated. The purple lines are voters of color, again, no college and college. And here, again, just to remind you, this doesn't go back quite as far as the previous graph, but the story is relatively the same among white voters, which is that you see these lines moving generally in parallel through the 2010 midterms. So the 2010 midterms, of course, is the first midterm election with Obama as president. And there you see the beginning of a pronounced move by non-college whites toward the Republican Party and whites with a college education toward the Democratic Party. And that gap becomes particularly pronounced in 2018, 2 weeks ago, when the difference between non-college and college whites in terms of their support for the Republican Party grew to 16 percentage points, which is pretty much unprecedented in polling history. So there's a number of ways to interpret this, and I have sociologist friends in the room, so I'm a little reluctant to use the word class, because I know you guys think a lot about that word, and we political scientists are a little, we're not so good about thinking about that question carefully. But I would say to you that some of this, or if not most of this, is about class differences that have emerged among white voters. And because education, now more than ever, is really quite determinative of your life chances, that education now is a proxy not only for your current standard of living, but your potential standard of living. The divide that we're seeing here is confounded with age, so that is younger voters are more likely to have a college education than older voters. And it's also, of course, confounded with income. But I would submit to you here, and it's, the other thing, of course, is that it's correlated with all kinds of cultural values and attitudes that are either socially liberal and therefore leads you to vote for the Democratic Party, or socially conservative and leads you to support the Republican Party. So all of those things are kind of mixed in here and is helping to tell the story about the growing divide along the lines of education among white voters. But I think it's not entirely a stretch to say that some of this you can talk about in terms of class. One of the kind of interesting implications here is really for the extent to which the two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are going to continue to be about arguing over the size and scope of government as they have long been over the last 50 years. So as you know, the Democratic Party typically talks about an expanded role for government and a large social safety net. The Republican Party typically talks about a small role for government and a shrunken social safety net. And one thing I'd like to kind of submit to you here is that this growing polarization among white voters on the basis of class, which is exactly in the opposite direction, right? Those without a college education whose life circumstances are much more vulnerable, much more perhaps overturnable by economic recession and other kinds of exogenous shocks to the economy. in theory, they're the ones who much more need the government social safety net than the white college voters who are increasingly becoming supporters of the Democratic Party. And so one interesting question becomes is if elections start to turn to a certain extent on where white voters stand between the two parties, I think that's going to lead to some tensions between the parties' long-standing commitments to their positions on the size and scope of government and their base voters. So, for example, one of the reasons that Trump did so well among non-college whites is that he pledged, for the first time in a long time of any Republican presidential candidate, not to touch Medicare or Social Security. Now, a long-standing project of Reagan-style conservatives has been to privatize Social Security, privatize Medicare, and remove these as entitlement programs that are guaranteed by the federal government. Trump realized, I think quite politically astutely, that that wasn't going to sell among the kinds of voters that he was going to make these socially, cultural appeals to, and he took those two programs off the table. What's interesting is that the Republican Congress continued to promote and pass bills that talked about dismantling these programs or changing them pretty radically. But interestingly enough, the extent to which there's talk about changing these programs and privatizing them has diminished somewhat among Republican leaders. So I think that's just one kind of example of how the changing class coalitions of the parties among white voters may be affecting the kinds of stances they take on really fundamental policies at the federal level. Let me show you one more example, and then I will give up the floor. So what I'm showing you here is a map of the United States where at the county level, counties are shaded by the share of total income claimed as state and local tax deductions in federal income tax returns. So state and local taxes include property taxes, and those of course have to do and are high in places that have expensive public schools. So if you look at that map, the shading tends to be in places that are pretty well off. They tend to be in places that are pretty suburban. And Ashley, you're actually not the only Jersey person here on the stage. I'm a Jersey guy. And so New Jersey is sort of the epicenter of the state and local tax deductions, as you can see by the shading of the state. So the GOP tax law passed in 2017 cut taxes across the board for most people. And one of the ways that they replaced some of the lost revenue was to dramatically put limits on the extent to which you could deduct the state and local taxes you had paid to local governments from your federal income tax. The people that hit the hardest were college-educated whites in well-to-do suburban areas who are paying high property taxes, have high enough incomes that they want to take these deductions, and it was a direct strike, essentially, at this new part of the Democratic coalition. Okay, it's essentially a tax on rich people who live in blue areas. Okay. And what you see here superimposed over this map of the deductions are black stars indicating where Republican districts switch to Democratic districts. And I won't make you squint at the match too much. There's a pretty strong correlation between those two things. I'm not saying that's the only cause, but it is part of the story of the 2018 election, which is essentially a revolt of upper income suburban folks saying, I don't want to pay these increased taxes that have been caused by Republican tax policy. So all of this is to say that there may be some interesting complications that are taking place with regard to the two parties' coalitions, and therefore there may be some switching in terms of the extent to which the two parties are disagreeing on the size and scope of government and who pays for government services going forward. Thank you.
Hi there, good evening. Let's try that again. Good evening. I'm really self-conscious. I just got back from MSNBC and I didn't have time to take off all of my makeup, so I feel like Shirley Temple. So I'm just gonna let that go. So I am not a Jersey folk. I always tell my students Jersey is basically like the Florida of the North with all your shenanigans. So as was said, I'm a professor of political science and American studies at Fordham University. I also teach a class at Columbia SEPA Race and American Policy class, and I'm also the 2018 NYU McSilver Institute Fellow. So I'm basically collecting affiliations with all the universities across New York City. So if anyone here is from CUNY, let's work together. So I really want to fill in some of the things that Ashley and Pat said. I mean, if you all aren't familiar with the Eagleton Institute, I really hope you look it up, just because they've been a great resource to me and so many scholars over the past few years. But you know, the map that Ashley put up essentially shows us that all states are red states, right? It's just whether or not you have enough blue cities in your red states to sort of flip it every 4 years. And so what this last election showed us is the importance of sort of not just federal elections, but obviously statewide elections too. And I want to drill down just a little bit throughout the course of my remarks. And so I think the larger question is we have to ask ourselves why we thought a wave was going to occur in the first place. Just because there were some pretty clear indications that there's some institutional mechanisms that kind of prevented what people thought was going to be a tsunami or a typhoon. So we could look at past midterm trends and say, okay, well, the first midterm election of an elected president, usually parties switch, right? So if we have unified government, we tend to go to divided government. Americans tend to feel more comfortable that way. So we could assume that Democrats would pick up some seats, and that shouldn't have been too surprising. We saw the types of Senate seats that were up for grabs. Those were predominantly Republicans, so we knew that there probably wouldn't be a massive blue wave, just thinking, thank you, about some of those states that were up. We also had to remember that there was the Kavanaugh factor that I sort of put in there. And fear-based tactics work, right? If they didn't, then people wouldn't use them. But this president is very effective in making sure that he sort of adds something to the public discourse and essentially drops it once it's no longer in vogue. So have we heard about the caravan since November 6th, right? Not that much. They're still about 1,000 miles away. The Kavanaugh bump was one of those things where the president was able to frame it for white women, who I'll get to in a second. And then there's this other piece that I want us to sort of dissect and think about, and the difference between voter fraud, voter suppression, and straight up voter theft. And so we constantly hear from Republicans about voter fraud, but we know for the most part we don't really have that in this country. We actually want more people to vote. During Barack Obama's historic 2008 election, we had barely 60% of voting eligible Americans who actually bothered to turn out. And that was one of the most exciting elections ever, right? And so oftentimes we tend to talk about elections in hyperbole, where everyone is excited. Who is everyone, right? We have to sort of define that. When we see that only 45% of voting eligible Americans actually bothered to turn out in the midterms. Granted, that's an increase from what we usually see, but that's still only 45% of Americans. So the fraud piece, we actually need more people to vote. We don't have people going in, changing hats, changing clothes, and going back to vote again. That's just, we haven't seen it. It's just not truthful. The voter suppression piece is real, though. Beyond just having machines delivered with no cords, right? A 4.5-hour line is a form of voter suppression, whether you sort of conceptualize it or not. Because we know that in particular communities, there's absolutely no such thing as a line. I vote on the Upper West Side, it's 1 minute. Because people on the Upper West Side will not tolerate a 4.5-hour line, right? But we know that particular communities are expected to wait in line, even though there are all these other costs to voting. And then there's theft. And so the example that I use of theft is Brian Kemp, right? Someone who did not recuse himself or resign even before his Republican primary. So you cannot have someone who's running for office who is both the candidate and the referee at the same time. And also the person who is in charge of the entire voting process. So this is in the state of Georgia. So we have to ask ourselves how we even got to the point of having a free and fair election in the first place when the person who's running is literally in charge of where every single voting machine goes and every single ballot that will be counted or not. And then I also wanted us to think about turnout, right? So we saw historic turnout from young people, obviously people of color, but also older whites turned out too because of this Kavanaugh caravan effect, because fear actually does work. So I think there's a fundamental difference between what many Democrats want to happen, and Ashley, you touched on this, versus what historically we know probably will happen. And so when thinking about Texas, Georgia, and Florida, so many of my students had to have them write prediction papers, right? So they have to pick a race of interest and then write why they think a particular candidate will win or lose. And for the most part, their political instincts are getting honed in and they're doing great. But in conversation, there's this desire to have particular candidates win. But when you actually look at the data, you know, Beto O'Rourke is an uphill battle in a very red Republican Texas state going against an incumbent, right? And even though there are lots of Latinos in Texas, the number of registered voting Latinos is still not at the numbers where it could or should be, right? Similarly, Georgia, historically, you know, white southern state, the fact that a black female Democratic candidate is going against the Secretary of State just because you may like Stacey Abrams, the chips are stacked, right? I always mix my metaphors. The chips are stacked against someone like Stacey Abrams for a host of reasons, racially, gender, and also party. And similarly in Florida, we know that Democrats and Republicans tend to have, the last 3 elections, in gubernatorial elections, there was a 1% divide between the Democrat and the Republican candidate in the gubernatorial race. So even if Gillum was able to have a close race, it wasn't guaranteed that he would necessarily be victorious because they have not had a Democratic governor in quite some time. So thinking about what we want versus what will be. And so we saw some gains for the House Democrats, and as Ashley alluded to, you know, this is something where it is historic. These are some of the largest gains we've seen in a generation, and that's also why we saw the firing of Jeff Sessions on the 7th, right? As a distraction from this narrative that is the highest wave of Democrats being elected in the House in a generation, right? If it weren't such a wave, I don't think that the president would choose November 7th to actually have this conversation about Jeff Sessions. So I want to complicate the gender gap because we know marriage, man, and motherhood is fine. But there is this thing called whiteness. And I think, you know, if for any of you who have read Jane Junn, who's a colleague of ours, who's for the political scientists in the room, she wrote a really great article called Hiding in Plain Sight, which really chronicles how white women have voted for the Republican presidential candidate every single year since 1952, except for 2 years, 1964 with LBJ, 1996 re-election of Bill Clinton. So the fact that there's an expectation that white women will vote democratically is actually not founded, right? If we look at the data, white women have consistently voted for the Republican Party. So this gender gap is actually women of color driving this idea that women vote democratically. Black women vote democratically, right? I think we've seen it. Ask Doug Jones. He knows 98% of black women got him into office, right? Obama knows that black women vote democratically. Georgia knows that black women vote democratically, but white women don't. And we have real data over time that shows that they actually never have, right? Except for 2 sort of specific elections. So when we think about a gender gap, we have to really be very clear as to who we're speaking about. Because white women have consistently shown, in Georgia, 74% of white women voted for Brian Kemp, right? In Texas, roughly 54% of white women voted for Cruz, and again, high 50s in Florida. To compare with high 90s for black women in all 3 states. So, that being said, let's also complicate suburbia. We know, shout out to, I have a book that was published last week. It's an edited volume called Black Politics in Transition, Immigration, Suburbanization, and Gentrification. And so when we think about the suburbs, many people use the suburbs as a proxy for white. That's no longer the case. Laurie Frazier at UCLA has great data and research on the sort of the coloring of the suburbs. So oftentimes we hear scholars say suburbs, and it's like wink, wink, I mean white people, but that's actually not the composition of the suburbs anymore, right? We know that whites now want cities, so cities are becoming whiter, and suburbs are becoming more diverse with black and Latino, and more class diverse as well. Rural communities haven't really been touched, right? Ask Claire McCaskill, that's why she's unemployed. And she spent a lot of time trying to go to rural communities, which was somewhat problematic because when they interviewed people in the cities and the outer ring suburbs where many blacks were pushed out, think about Ferguson. Ferguson is a suburb of St. Louis, right? Many of them said, well, I feel like she spends so much time in these rural communities trying to talk to Trump voters. Is she gonna talk to us, right? Am I supposed to door knock for her in 90-degree heat in Missouri in the summer? So, I mean, these are complications that statewide electeds are having to deal with because when we say cities, that's no longer urban, right? That's no longer a proxy for black, and suburb is no longer a proxy for white. That being said, where are we? So, okay, moving on to young people. I think it's fascinating that, you know, when Andrew Gillum, the mayor of Tallahassee, won the Democratic primary, and many people were quite shocked, right? Because he ran against a very crowded and I would argue a qualified field. I wasn't that shocked because Andrew Gillum was the only candidate who actually met with the Parkland kids in the state of Florida. And when I talk to my students about sort of what is an issue of great concern for them, I'm trying to get them to understand that all things are political, but obviously things in their lives have real consequences, right? If anyone's on student loans, you should know who your electeds are, right? If you care about climate change, et cetera. But my students are growing up in an era where they had active shooter drills, something that I did not have. Some of us who were, I don't want to have you guess my age, but we did not have that. Columbine occurred when I was in college. And so gun control is a real concern for them. So the fact that Andrew Gillum was tapping into young voters and helping them get registered with the Parkland kids and using gun control. And so you saw a lot of the Democratic candidates really touting this F from the NRA as a sense of pride actually means something, and I think that's somewhat of a canary in the mine. And then Pat talked a little bit about diversity among sort of the incoming class of members of the House. And we saw this also on state levels, and diversity coming in many different ways, right? The new governor-elect of Colorado, who is a gay man, but he's also Jewish. And he was like, don't forget, I'm also the first Jewish governor of the state of Colorado, right? So we have a lot of diversity in a lot of different ways. But I think it's also important to remember a lot of, especially the black women who are going to Congress, they're going to Congress despite the Democratic Party. These are people who were not supported by their party in the primary. So we think about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez right here in New York, right? We had the Working Families Party, that's like the progressive party, that went with Joe Crowley, right? We had Bill de Blasio, who's the progressive mayor, who went with Joe Crowley. So no one supported Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It wasn't until she won the primary that Democrats got on board. Similarly with Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts, the first black woman to go to Congress from the state of Massachusetts. The Democratic Party supported her challenger. Now granted, he's an incumbent, but you have the CBC members, the Congressional Black Caucus, supporting her challenger, right? And so we see time and time again, we know that Joe Biden, snuck down to Georgia during the primary and supported, not actively, but met with Stacey Evans and not Stacey Abrams, even though Stacey Abrams won 153 out of the 159 counties in Georgia, right? So we see this lack of institutional support in the beginning when many candidates of color actually really need it, and it's not until after their own grassroots organization, their own fundraising outside and separate from the party, that we then see the party get on board. So that's something that the Democrats need to sort of sit down and think about long and heavily about, because these women are getting there without their help. And in thinking about the GOP's long road ahead, right? We've seen the pictures of what the incoming GOP freshman class looks like. It's almost entirely white and male, and we've seen the incoming Democratic freshman class that is incredibly female and incredibly diverse on a whole host of levels. And so the Republicans really have to ask themselves if they want to be the party of whites only. There's some rhetoric and some narrative surrounding that, but what does that strategy look like going forward? Especially because many Republicans lost statewide seats, and Republicans had roughly 2/3 of state houses and 2/3 of governorships, and we're seeing that tide slowly change. And that's where a lot of action occurs, and that's where a lot of money takes place. So we know that the New York State budget is $168 billion. We know that the Democrats now control the Senate, the legislature, and the governorship, even though Andrew Cuomo can be a little shifty as his Democratic alliances, but he's still a Democrat, at least on paper, right? And I think it's fascinating that, how we frame these issues, right, especially with entitlement programs, because Republicans have been so successful in framing entitlement programs to whites as code for black giveaways, right, a la Reagan welfare queens. But the reality of the matter is whites depend on entitlement programs, right? They call them something else, but Medicare and Medicaid are the predominantly white programs. And so how do you frame your rhetoric to sort of make sure your base stays with you, even though you have to shift it? And I was fascinated with Prop 4 in Florida. Does anyone know what Prop 4 was? What's that? Giving formerly incarcerated individuals, felons, the right to vote, right? And I thought, my hypothesis, I thought that if Andrew Gillum was successful, that Prop 4 would fail, right? Because I thought that voters would say, okay, I'll take this 39-year-old black governor, but giving formerly incarcerated individuals the right to vote again might be a bridge too far. Full shout out to the Jersey folks, bridge too far. But I always have to do the jab. Get it? But it's Friday, wake up. So the issue though is Andrew Gillum thus far has not declared victory and he has not won, and so the margin isn't looking like he'll be able to make it up. But Prop 4 did pass. And so we have to ask ourselves why and who voted for it, right? And so there needs to be a little bit of policy prospecting there, especially since opioid addiction and substance abuse are so prevalent now within white communities, right? And we're talking about in a very different way of criminal justice. It's a way of sort of rehabilitation and not incarceration. And I'm wondering how many people voted for that because they have loved ones who are currently involved in some sort of opioid addiction or some sort of addiction where they're now interacting with the state and the criminal justice system in ways that they haven't seen before. I don't know, but I'm really interested to see what that data brings forth. And so I think I'll just wrap up. I mean, I don't want to take too much time, but I do think that we need to sort of zoom out 30,000 feet and ask ourselves, are we indeed in a constitutional crisis? The framers set up the judicial, executive, and legislative branches very specifically so that they're supposed to be an equilateral triangle, and they're not really functioning, they haven't really functioned that way in the past 2 years. We'll see what happens with a new Democratic House and how divided government will either create gridlock or deadlock, or if we will sort of be able to get back to what the framers intended so long ago. I have lots of other thoughts, but we can talk about those during Q&A. So, thank you.
Okay, the last time I was invited to speak at an IPK event, I assured the audience in the spring of 2016 that there was absolutely 100% no chance Donald Trump could be elected president. I'm actually surprised you guys have invited me back. But at any rate, I'm a political sociologist. To follow on Pat's comments, if political scientists have not spent enough time thinking about class, I've probably spent far too much time thinking about it. I will have a couple things to say that I hope you'll find interesting. So I thought I'd maybe talk about 4 puzzles that to me seem sort of interesting about both the midterms and kind of where we are. So one relates to the kind of potential shifting of the electoral coalitions of the 2 major parties. The second is the discussion about the rise of progressive forces inside the Democratic Party. Third, I want to say something about turnout. It's come up, but I think we haven't said enough about just how dramatic the increase in turnout really was. You'd have to go back to the mid-60s to find turnout in midterm elections of the voting eligible population to be similar. And then finally, if I have time, I'll say something about kind of gerrymandering and electoral institutions. Okay, so that's the agenda. All right, let's go. So one thing that I think is very interesting about the Trump election is that it is at least possible that it signaled something that presidential elections sometimes do, which is that some underlying shifts in the alignment of social groups and parties may first appear in presidential elections and then only later in terms of partisanship, party identification, and so forth. So presidential elections sometimes can serve as the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. And so, we have examples like 1896, 1932, 1980, and some very interesting things happened in 2016 with respect to a couple of interesting constituencies. And I think the most striking one, which has received a lot of commentary, are the success Trump had with working class white voters. And more generally, sort of how is the Trump coalition and the kind of ethno-nationalist race baiting agenda that excuse me for using the loaded term, but nonetheless, I think that those, is this kind of creating the conditions for a realignment of the 2 parties? And I think 2018 gives us some hints that it's not. I think that, one thing was very interesting is that the Democratic share of the white vote is up to 44% from high 30s in recent presidential and midterm elections. Democrats made their biggest gains in House seats that were the most red, in particular in some places that seemingly were completely out of reach. And in particular, looking overall, poor voters are back in a Democratic alignment from a pretty remarkable shift towards Trump in 2016. And if anything, 2018 seems to me to signal perhaps a further drift towards some shifts in the Democratic coalition that actually may serve the Democratic Party well in the future. So let me just run through these. First of all, I think the shift among younger cohorts of voters is really dramatic, and it is continuing. In fact, it deepens in 2018. And one of the things that scholars of cohort effects have found is that sometimes electoral moments that are very dramatic and profound can keep a cohort in partisan alignment for their entire lives. And so we saw that, I think, with the New Deal generation in the 30s, and I think we also saw it to some extent with the people who came of age in the Reagan era, who, I guess that includes me, and we are now, in a more than 45 years old, and more than 50 years old in some cases. We are, strongly Republican. We, but among younger voters, both, very young voters, and also now increasingly people in their 30s and even slightly older are really, now seemingly in a pretty strong and consistent Democratic alignment. And this process really starts in 2004, and it has deepened in every cycle, or not in an exact linear fashion, but nonetheless, I think that's really important. And then the second thing is that the continuing alignment of minority voters and their growing share in the proportion of the electorate. The voting eligible population is now 30% non-white and will continue to grow. The challenge, of course, will be whether or not turnout rates among the non-white voters can begin to get closer to that of whites. So I think in many ways this election to me signals that the potential that Trump kind of represented a sort of realignment probably isn't as likely to produce sustained Republican advantage. And I think as the Republican Party becomes Trumpier after 2018, which I think a lot of people think it will, the implications of that are likely to persist. So, okay, second puzzle I wanted to take up is the progressive activists inside the Democratic Party, progressive candidates. Christina mentioned a couple examples. Got a lot of attention in this cycle. There is, I think, without question, a groundswell of increased activism on the part of younger people who identify with the left. Socialism among people under 30 is quite popular, and so forth. I think this election actually kind of highlights just really across the country just how kind of weak these progressive forces are. So there were about 10 progressive insurgent candidates who knocked off mainstream Democratic candidates in surprising elections. About 5 of them were actually elected. Ocasio-Cortez is one. That sort of signals just, in most of the cases, the candidates, the insurgent candidates endorsed by Sanders and others were beaten. And also, when we look at where the Democrats made gains nationally, they tended to be in districts that were very moderate. They tended to be picking up moderate, more centrist Democrats or moderate Democrats, and that those members of the House in particular are likely to resist a kind of more left policy drift that many progressives would like to see. Now, one thing I think, though, that as we look to 2020, in the sort of theoretical world of the famous book, The Party Decides, John Zoller and his colleagues, the role of party activists in anointing presidential candidates is a critical part of how the sorting process actually works, and in essence what political parties really are in the United States. They're really activists who get involved in local party organizations. And in this sense, I think the growing importance or size and significance of these younger activist left progressive activists that are kind of beginning to energize the Democratic Party from below may have the potential to push the party to the left in 2020 with unknown impact on elections. But I think that would be where I guess I see some possibility for progressive forces to actually have some impact on the party. So third puzzle, turnout. As both Ashley and Christina mentioned, the voting eligible turnout was about 49%. This is a really significant spike from recent midterm elections. As I mentioned, you'd have to go back to the 60s to find a similar result. And it actually felt to me like the first time at midterm elections, media is always talking about long lines and high turnout, and it actually kind of seemed right that actually something was going on here. So what are the implications here, and what drove this turnout? So first of all, I think the turnout was really a partisan draw. That is to say, Trump's and the mobilization around questions of anti-immigrant sentiment, race, and so forth really seemed to actually have a pretty significant effect. And here's my evidence for this is admittedly somewhat loose, but it's very striking just how turnout rates were in very, very red states like Alabama, where there were no real significant competitive races, and yet turnout was far higher than it's been at any point in the past. I think in Alabama, the estimated turnout is about 48%, for example, and that's true in many other very red states where the voters are coming out to express their support for Trump, the Trump agenda. It's a symbolic vote. It's not necessarily competitive elections. I just wanted to do a quick shout out to Christina's point about Florida's Prop 4. I've been thinking about felon disenfranchisement for a long time, and actually I think the result was not that surprising, just because most Americans have supported re-enfranchisement of ex-felons who've served their time and are living in their community and paying taxes. I think its importance lies in the fact that Florida is a critical swing state. We're talking about the enfranchisement of about 1.2 million people. And I think if those voters had voted, Gillum would have won the governorship, Nelson would have held the Senate seat, and potentially some other congressional seats in Florida, House seats might have been in play. So I think that's something worth keeping our eye on. Okay, fourth puzzle. What about gerrymandering, electoral institutions, the monkey business that has, as I think Christina rightly called our attention to? So I want to point out I want to bend the stick in the other direction slightly. I think there's been a lot of kind of misleading and ultimately taking a few anecdotes and exaggerating them into a broad national profile with respect to the question of partisan gerrymandering. So the Democrats got almost exactly the correct share of vote in 2018. They won about 53.5% of the two-party vote, and they ended up, well, I guess we don't know the final tally, but they'll be very close to where they should be. The recent elections really, basically we've got two cases where the vote seat distribution looks really somewhat out of balance in Republicans' favor. It's also striking that no one ever talks about the fact that for 50 years in the New Deal era, the Democrats were ruthlessly gerrymandering across the country. We're almost every election getting more seats than their vote share they would have been entitled to. As recent as 1978, for example, Republicans got 47% of the vote and only 34% of the House seats, a far bigger disparity than anything we've seen in this recent era that's gotten so much attention. So all this discussion of gerrymandering, its impact, I think maybe has been a little overblown, but what's been underplayed, I think, is the importance of how the Senate and the Senate map is really beginning to work to the Republicans' advantage. So we have a lot of small states that have pretty significant Republican advantage in which the distribution of Senate seats favors those smaller states. It's pretty striking that as recently as 2010, the Democrats had 60 Senate seats. It seems almost inconceivable right now to imagine that or remember that. But 2018, I think, gave us no indication that these small and very red states are likely to be competitive in the near future. There are a few bright spots on the map for the Democrats, particularly out west. But overall, I think there's kind of a major uphill battle in terms of the impact of the Senate and kind of where that becomes kind of the bastion of Republican partisan dominance. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anyway, if I could invite our panelists to come up and we have time for questions. Is it on now? There we go. Perfect. Thank you. I see someone, was that a question? Way in the back there? Yes, please, go ahead.
I don't want a second.
Thank you so much. It's been really interesting talk. Very, very good for all of us to have a clear idea of the election. So I wanted to ask any of the presenters if, because it's been historic in many ways, and we have seen here with all the data and the explanation with the gap, you know, like race, Latinos, women. So, yes, so what can we, how do we see for the 2020 election? Can we have any signs that maybe the electorate is changing? Maybe it's a little bit too soon. We don't know about the Democratic candidate, but still, can we get some hints about what could happen in the 2020 election? It's too soon. What are your I wanted to share with you this question, if you can give to us some insight.
Okay, so the question is, what happens in 2020 now? That's a big one. Would like to take the first crack at it?
I could
Go ahead, Pat. Yeah.
Just very briefly, it's very hard to know what's going to happen this far out, but there's two things that are pretty strong predictors of whether somebody gets reelected. One is whether they're an incumbent, and usually incumbents get reelected. And second is the state of the economy. And as the economy gets better, incumbents get reelected. So based upon what we know now, Trump is definitely better than a 50% odds of being reelected. There's kind of two kind of questions. One is, does the economy continue to grow at the rate that it's been growing, particularly with the potential for inflationary pressures to ramp up given all the government spending? And then the other thing is that Trump has consistently, in terms of approval rating and other metrics, performed below where you'd expect given the healthy state of the economy. And so it's possible that that penalty will continue to be in play in 2020, which would depress his vote share.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that?
I think we also need to look at the Republican advantage of the electoral map. But by the same token, I think Newt Gingrich just said the other day something to the effect of there's just not enough Republican voters in the future, and the party needs to be careful of that. I think, like Pat said, it's very hard to know what's going to happen. My dissertation was on the autopsy report in 2013 of the Republican Party, and we see where their desire in 2013 to look after demographics and diversity went in 2016. So I think it's so hard to tell at this point out, but I think the electoral map is key to look at, and I think, I think demographics will play a role one way or the other.
Can I just also?
Yes, absolutely.
I do also think that it depends on who's at the top of the ticket for Democrats to sort of help inspire folks. When Michael Avenatti said, we need a good old-fashioned white man, and lots of people clutched their pearls and were like, I can't believe he said that. It's like a lot of Democrats think that too, right? And so that's going to be the big divide within the party. Do you have sort of like a white man at the top and then someone interesting as the VP? Or, do you sort of let the Democrats fight it out? I mean, we know that there are going to be at least 20 totally different types of people, right? You've got like your Senate crew, you've got your mayors who are hanging out there, you've got your billionaires, you've got these governors who some of us have heard of, some of us haven't. I mean, so there are just a lot of choices we have. I think, also with the Republicans, Newt Gingrich is right. Like if you are becoming the party of just white people, right? We also have seen Trump's agenda of like, you can't create any more white people in this country. We're kind of maxed out, right? Irish, Jews, Germans, Italians. And so we've seen Trump sort of, if you can't make more white people, you have to get rid of colored people, right? And we're seeing that agenda, which could backfire on him because there are lots of people of color who are now feeling as though this is just a bit too much. But we also can't assume that all Latino voters or Latinx voters identify with the Democratic Party, because we see the voting in Texas and Arizona, we've seen this kind of closed door policy where it's like, well, I've made it and I don't want these new immigrants coming in and sort of taking what I have. So we have some time to sort of try and sift through.
Yeah, just a point of information to follow up on that. What do the exits show about? I recall, perhaps incorrectly, that 29% of Latino or Latinx voters voted for Trump in 2016. Is that? And so do we know from the exits yet what the Latino Latinx breakdown between Democrat and Republican, say, in the House looks like?
I think we saw 3/4 for the Democratic candidate. I don't remember off the top of my head.
So
but
it's not that far off. It's
yeah, and especially in the competitive races, they went for the Democratic candidate. So
okay.
One thing that's interesting, the exit polls showed this year, is that Asian Americans were much more Democratic than Latinos. So that's a whole new thing, and Asian Americans are growing at a much more rapid rate as a share of the population than Latinos. That might be actually the new part of the Democratic coalition that no one's really paying attention to.
Right.
No one is paying attention to it, and I've been ringing the alarm about that because, I mean, also, let's be clear, Asian Americans are also the fastest growing undocumented population in the United States as well. So there are a lot of people who are in a mixed status household, and so Democratic policies are a little more attractive to Asian Americans on the West Coast and also the East Coast.
Look, I just say one thing. The question with Latinx voters is really, turnout. And if they were turning out at the same level as whites, Democrats would have a major national advantage. It's the relatively low levels of turnout that have kind of weakened that impact. But most people expect over time that turnout rates among Latino voters will increase, and as a consequence that there will be a kind of steady growing Democratic advantage.
Okay, there was one other question over here. Yes.
About the gender gap, and I really enjoy.
Could you use the mic, please?
Oh.
Yeah, thank you.
I thought my voice was really loud already.
It's just for recording. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I had a question about the discussion of like your analysis of the gender gap, and I guess both Professor Greer and
You don't need to remember their names. It's okay.
yeah, okay, thank you. And basically what I was wondering is to what extent marriage might be part of what marriage status might be part of the explanation of why the gender gap is driven by Black women. So because I was like, if I recall your presentation correctly, you said that like people who are married women are more likely to vote Republican, and so we know that marriage rates are lower among African Americans, and so I wonder whether that might be part of the explanation. And I'm definitely interested in hearing more about it and the ways in which perhaps marriage status might be come.
No, I mean it doesn't. I mean, Black women vote democratically, married, single, otherwise, widowed, doesn't matter, right? I mean, I essentially say that Black women are the canaries in the mine for the Democratic Party. They're the keepers of the big D Democratic Party, and also, one might argue, democracy, right? Because oftentimes the issues that are of great concern to Black women, they're trying to tell other Democrats, you need to vote for this candidate, as imperfect as he or she may be, because if you don't, here are all the things that happen, right? There's no such thing as a women's issue. All issues are, like all women's issues are just, they're community issues, right? Because women sort of are interacting in the community and getting paid less. So like all these issues are fundamentally important. So the marriage piece doesn't matter. I mean, and the marriage rates among Black women are like slightly less than white women. It's not the huge gulf that is sort of purported by Republicans for the most part. So we still see high 90% for Black women across the board, because I think in a lot of their races, they view the Republican candidate as usually dangerous to them, their communities, and larger society. No, I don't. I think that when we dissect the racial dynamics, if we leave white women out, women of color, especially Black women specifically, vote democratically. The reason why it seems as though there's this interesting narrative is because we add in white women in the mix, but for the most part, white women are Republicans. Like, we can look at sort of certain places, sure, but like when we're looking at sort of big presidential elections, white women have been very consistent in their allegiances. Not in, it's not 90 to 10 like we see with black women, but it's still, you know, a higher majority of white women vote Republican than otherwise.
Yeah, I just want to echo Christina. I don't think we can understand the gender gap without understanding the intersectionality of the gender gap. We have to take into account race, ethnicity, and class and education to understand what the gender gap really is and what it means.
There was another question back here.
Thank you. I wonder if any of you has a readout on what's been going on with political money for the midterms. I've seen reports, Center for Responsive Politics, that seem to suggest that an outraising of money or outspending on the Democrats' part. And as far as I can recall, that would be a recent surge, because the stories I recall in the spring were that the Democrats were way behind throughout 2017 at all levels of giving. So I wonder what's happened with political finance relative to the midterms, and what were the causes and what are the consequences of that?
So a couple of things. One, there were a number of very large Democratic donors, including Michael Bloomberg and some others who came into the process relatively late. The Democrats had a mammoth, or mammoth is maybe not quite the right word, but the Democrats had a major advantage overall. You know, this, I think in general, we often pay too much attention to money that the Democrats have, you know, even in races where election cycles where they're either party's behind, they raise enough to be, you know, competitive across the country, and especially because there's a subset of, you know, really kind of competitive races where funding matters.
Sorry, can I just add something really quickly? You know, with Beto O'Rourke, $38 million, historic, right? I blame Tom Perez. I think that he has not developed a real, and you guys can, you know, disagree, but I don't think that he's really developed a democratic framework and foundation across many states. And so there's a lot of work that he could have and should have done in the state of Texas. So when Beto O'Rourke has $38 million and 2 weeks left to go, it's sort of like Brewster's Millions. You don't really have a real infrastructure to actually use that money effectively. And so I think that we saw Democrats are really good. I mean, you all probably got those emails every 2 minutes, right? I mean, there was a level of kind of like fear-based fundraising too, right? So it's like, Trump did this again, give me $3, right? And you have, I mean, you know these emails. And so I think that there are a lot of Democrats who have seen the past 2 years, and it's like, well, my $5 actually might help. And so we're seeing this.
This is part of, I think, part of the reason why money is kind of an exaggerated force. I mean, you can only spend so much. You get diminishing marginal returns. You can only run so many ads. You know, if the party is really heavily invested in door-to-door canvassing, they might get, you know, higher turnout, but, you know, both parties can match, and in a sense it's a draw. But overall, it's just really hard to get additional payoff past, you know, some threshold.
You have diminished returns.
And I think, you know, candidates like O'Rourke, who drew, you know, immense amounts of money, at some point you know, he's not getting the payoff that
and also it seems like we're in a new era where, you know, in past iterations, the central party organization would have had a greater share of the total financing and would have pulled money out of Texas at the end, rather than having these individual large donors putting it where they probably put, you know, if they just cared about getting Democrats elected, would have dialed it back a little bit on Beto towards the end and put it elsewhere.
But think about someone like Doug Jones, right? An outside expenditure got $1 million, and that's the outside expenditure that organized all the black women so he could get 98% of the black female vote, right? That was the difference. That wasn't Democratic money. That was sort of some outside, and that's a relatively small amount of money, but the framing of how to use the money and utilize it in an effective way for a very specific group of people actually made the difference. So it's not just kind of money for money's sake.
Another question from over here? Yes?
Hi, thank you for this very interesting discussion. Jeff, I was interested that you pointed out the problem of the Senate for the presidential politics going forward. And I'm wondering if we could talk about the intersectionality of rural red states and education. What's happening with education in those states? And if the education levels go up among white men, does that make those states more competitive, or does the ruralness, the sparseness of those states trump education?
Well, I mean, the overriding advantage is partisanship, right? So these are places now that have large Republican partisan advantages and looking to demographic factors like levels of education and so forth, as long as that partisan alignment exists in these places, it will be very, very difficult for any Democratic challenger, unless it's a very unusual situation like the Doug Jones case in Alabama, to break through. And I'm not sure that I could identify any particular sort of way in which those places might start trending Democratic.
We had another question right up front here.
Hi, so my question is, where do you think the Republican Party is going? Because right now you see many Republicans are kind of blindly following Trump. And I'm just wondering, because you mentioned how the older white generation voters are maxed out. Maybe in the future, Republicans are trying to be maybe more liberal to capture the attention of younger voters. And how the election results in US will influence ward, kind of, because you are seeing more conservative leaders getting onto the stage right now because of the Trump effect. Yeah.
I can at least give you a first answer to that. I think one thing that is probably surprised a number of us was how little incumbent Republicans after the 2016 election tried to distinguish themselves from Trump. And they suffered the consequences in the House in terms of the number of Republican incumbents who lost in these seats that were relatively moderate. I think voters basically saw no difference between them and the kinds of policies and rhetoric that Trump had adopted. And one of the reasons for that is very strategic, which is Republicans and Democrats for that matter, but Republicans are terrified of losing their primaries. So Republican primaries in most districts, even moderate districts, the majority of Republican voters are people who approve of Trump and like what he's doing. And so the peril for a Republican who would like to distinguish him or herself from Trump is that she may lose her primary and therefore not even get to show up for the general election. And that is a quandary I think that they're going to continue to face at least over the next 2 years.
There's an interesting asymmetry here between the Democrats and Republicans. So many Democratic, centrist Democratic candidates around the country explicitly said they would not vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker, signaling that Nancy Pelosi is too far to the left. In some sense, I think there is a bigger political market for centrism inside the Democratic Party nationally than there is for moderation on the Republican side.
And I also just want to say, I think we've seen a loss of moderates as well in the Republican Party, whether we're talking about Jeff Flake or, unfortunately, John McCain, and those voices have gone away for one reason or, unfortunately, another, which is also then leaves those who are strongly Trump or those who are terrified in primaries left in the party.
Another question here.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion. So as an international student, what I really care about is that the divided government resulted by the midterm election. How this divided government can weaken the effect of Trump. Like he has like this sort of like xenophobic policies or like his thought something. I mean like, if the government is divided, how can this government weaken the effect of like this Trump?
Okay, so the question is, how might the fact that the Democrats control the House hinder the administration from pursuing the agenda that it has so far, or not hinder, depending upon the type of policies that you're considering? Anybody want to?
Well, there'll be no money for a wall. I think I can safely predict that that will be one outcome. I mean, a Democratic House can obviously use investigatory powers. How that will play out and what exactly will come out of that process is unclear. Whether or not Trump will ever turn over his tax returns and whether we'll have a constitutional crisis over the subpoena power of the House is also an interesting thing to keep an eye on. But overall, in principle, Trump should have to bargain with the Democratic House in a way that he didn't before. Trump is not a conventional president, so it's a little less clear how exactly they're going to manage policy moving forward. But in principle, he should have to bargain with the Democrats.
Right. I mean, he wasn't terribly successful under unified government as far as passing legislation, because, I mean, he doesn't really know how government works. And so I think the framing, I mean, I don't feel like I'm talking out of school. Like, that's just a fact. I mean, I don't think he understands the role of the presidency, nor does he respect it. And so I do think that he'll be able to frame any failures as, well, I tried, but, you know, these doggone Democrats just kept blocking me, especially if Nancy Pelosi is chosen as the speaker yet again. I do think, though, that, you know, I don't think that Chuck Schumer is the man we need, or is the man Democrats need in a minority. You know, it's been said that Chuck Schumer under a Hillary Clinton presidency and a Democratic majority would be a fantastic majority leader. Chuck Schumer under a Trump presidency and a Democratic minority is not. I mean, we haven't heard a peep from him. I don't even know where he is, right? And so I actually wouldn't put money on the fact that Schumer wouldn't make a deal where we're giving money for a wall, as ridiculous and arbitrary as it may be. And so President Trump is a deal maker, and we've seen him sort of just make deals that people weren't expecting. And I do think that Chuck Schumer is willing to acquiesce in ways that will be disappointing to certain Democrats as well.
Well, Schumer might, in fact, they have compromised. There is $1.6 billion in the budget for starting construction on new walls, so that has already happened. But a Democratic House fundamentally changes the equation. Schumer is not the critical actor anymore. It's the House and the presidency that will have to, if there's to be any policy, it will have to come out of that that dialogue.
Okay, and we got time for one more question. We're gonna have to be real quick here because we're over time. So if we can, yeah, exactly.
All right. Just
Pressure on them too.
Just want to say thank you. Okay, real quick. Since, as far as I've been looking into this, since 2002 with Roy Barnes losing re-election in Georgia, rural African American communities outside of Augusta, Columbus, Macon, and Albany, they've been trending more Republican. Are rural African American communities, are they shrinking? Are they moving towards, in Georgia in particular, are they going towards the suburbs in Gwinnett and Cobb? Or are they just moving elsewhere? Or are they simply not voting? Or is there greater voter suppression than there was in the past?
I've been studying Georgia. I think it's both. But keep in mind, all politics is local, right? And so the reason why Republicans, and when we say like, okay, they voted Republican, it's not like gangbusters, it's just more than, say, 8%. But I think that because politics is local, you have local Republicans who've been able to go and sort of either promise very local things, or they have real relationships, right, with particular state legislators or state senators or mayors or whatever it may be. But I do think that there are some trends as far as moving into more urban, suburban type counties, and also just, I mean, I think we're at a moment where you have to think about, you know, you can no longer have an a la carte presidency with Donald Trump. So I think a lot of people are trying to figure out, like, do you subscribe to the fact that all Mexicans are rapists and there should be a Muslim ban? You know, you can only tell yourself it's for tax cuts for but so long. And so I think that that's also a crisis, not just for African Americans, but for Republicans who are trying to be moderate and trying to figure out what the future of the party is.
Okay, well, thank you to our four speakers and to all of you for showing up tonight.